Yeah, it was just like,
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I've never thought about it, and it's weird. In the Pakistani side of the story, we obviously don't talk about the people who lived on what is now Pakistan and went to India. That might as well have never have happened as far as our school stuff is concerned. And the Muslims made the choice and they moved here, etc., etc. So it makes sense from a historical and Indian perspective, a factual perspective, that people who were not Muslim were pushed out,
mm,
essentially.
yeah,
What's the story about? Because there's still lots of Muslims in India,
yeah.
and but sort of an equal amount moved across. What's the
Yeah.
vibe as to why did they move?
It really depends on where on the political spectrum
Right.
you see this issue, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like the Indian left, right, would probably say something along the lines of like, oh, Muslims feared for their future as minorities in like independent India. So they made the decision to form, their own
Which is
state.
our line as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
But what the Indian left would clarify is like, oh, but that wasn't the right decision, you
Right.
know? Like
Right.
that's whereas like the Indian right would probably say something like, oh, it was like an Islamist separatist movement.
Right. Right.
Like, they wanted to, form like yeah, it's like separatism.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah.
how,
Like they had an opportunity to make their own place and they just took it.
yeah,
There
yeah, and
wasn't really an issue.
they weren't willing to coexist like
Right, sure.
um like Ashraf's chauvinism, like that kind of narrative from that's like your very BJP narrative and like
Right.
this is what so Congress would probably say something like Congress is like kind of center left, but like that's the thing. It's like I think what oh yeah, on one side it's that same narrative that they were fearing for their future as minorities, but this wasn't the way to go about it. Is what
Yeah.
like yeah, and
Yeah.
basically two nation theory as a whole is just not very accepted in India. But to an extent, I fear like as under the BJP that Indian Muslims are starting to um feel like
Maybe
oh
that
well,
wasn't such a bad idea.
not necessarily. Maybe it wasn't such a
Or
bad idea. It's like it's a really interesting. I think there's a really interesting debate happening now, and there's two ways of looking at it. One is like that the BJP is like vindicating two nation theory in that like Jinnah was right. These communities could never coexist, and look what's happening to like
a lot of Pakistani Twitter would love that argument, which is
that,
what,
that
yeah,
yeah, and I've seen that come up on Dawn. I've seen like of op-eds,
yeah,
Modi has proved Jinnah correct,
yeah,
right?
which,
Um, that's one way, and the other way of looking at it, which I've seen from Pakistani commentators as well, and like some Indian leftist commentators, is that had had the partition not happened, then these communities would have formed like a counterblock to each other, and
hmm,
so you wouldn't have had the opportunity for people like Modi, for people like Zia, because the communities would have kind of counterbalanced in that way.
yeah,
Obviously, it's far easier for the BJP to come up with this Islamophobic rhetoric when there's only 13% of the country is Muslim. But like
yeah,
what it would have been had the lines not been drawn, uh, they wouldn't have been able to get away with it. So there's really two ways of looking at it.
yeah.
I don't think you can. I don't think I'm in a position to say which one is like right or
Oh
wrong.
no, of course, of course.
Yeah.
And the Pakistani side that says Jinnah was right, hashtag and all that, very
Mm.
conveniently ignore Pakistan's own not very good treatment of our relative minorities. So it's obviously no one's
Yeah.
really being fully rational. But
Yes. In 46, there was a Congress activist called Azad, like Abdul Kalam Azad.
mhm,
And so at the time of partition, he made this argument that minorities would be safe because of hostage theory. He called this like mutually assured hostages, because that if the Muslims were the hostages in India and the Hindus and the Sikhs were the hostages in Pakistan, and no country could afford to oppress its own minorities because the same thing would happen on the
mhm,
other side. And so that would his whole theory was that would prevent in like kind of this nuclear mutually assured
right,
destruction,
yeah, yeah,
right? His theory was that would prevent the oppression of minorities. It turns out he got half of that right, which
mm,
was if one would oppress, the other would also oppress, but it didn't lead to none of them. It led to both of them oppressing their minorities, which is kind
yeah,
of what's across, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh now. So, Yeah, I feel he only had 50% of that that
Yeah,
equation
yeah,
correct.
yeah, yeah.
And I'm like highly skeptical of these mutually assured destruction leads to peace arguments.
Yeah, I mean, people will just go way farther than you expect them to. They're like, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
fuck it, we're doing it. It's fine.
yeah.